An event happens. A situation unfolds. Within minutes, explanations start forming. One version says it was intentional. Another says it was an accident. A third says it was inevitable, something that was going to happen given the conditions. Clips circulate. Statements get quoted. Numbers get pulled in. Each side points to something that looks like evidence, but as more information comes in, agreement doesn't improve, it gets worse. And at a certain point, the disagreement stops being about the event itself and turns into something else. Which explanation is real, and whether an explanation can actually be trusted? That's the question we're going to answer here. This is the Section 451 brief. I'm Captain TJ Duck, and this channel operates as a part of Section 451. The function here is simple. We take public arguments and test whether they actually hold together. Not at the level of opinions, not at the level of personalities, at the level of structure. Because most arguments don't fail because people disagree. They fail because the reasoning underneath them doesn't survive contact with reality. Most debates follow a predictable pattern. A claim gets made, people pick sides, then evidence gets gathered, not to test the claim, but to defend their position. At that point, the outcome is already locked in. Each side builds a case around what they already believe, and the argument turns into a contest of narratives, not a test of whether the explanation actually works. That's where the breakdown starts. Because if you never isolate how a claim is supposed to function, you can't test whether it's true. And if you can't test it, you can't resolve it. Most arguments never identify their own dependency. They describe outcomes, but not mechanisms. They say, this happened because of this, but they don't explain how. What actually connects the cause to effect? What conditions have to exist for that explanation to work? That missing piece is where most arguments fail, because if the mechanism isn't clear, it can't produce reliable predictions. And if it can't produce predictions, it can't be tested against reality. At that point, the argument becomes unfalsifiable, and unfalsifiable arguments don't resolve, they just keep going. Section 451 approaches arguments differently. Every analysis follows a fixed sequence. First, the claim, what's being asserted. Then the strongest version of that claim. Not a weak version, the version that actually makes sense if you assume that it's true. Then we isolate the fault line. The single point the entire argument depends on, the mechanism. X leads to Y because Z. If that mechanism holds, the claim holds. If it breaks, the claim collapses. From there we move to predictions. If the explanation is correct, we should observe specific patterns in reality, not general trends, specific outcomes. Then we test those predictions against what actually happens, not what people say happens, not what gets reported, what can be verified. And from that, we reach a structural verdict. Not which side we prefer, which explanation actually works. One additional standard applies here. When a verified claim is made, it's sourced. On screen, a QR code will appear. That code leads to a source ledger, a page listing the claims made in the episode and the evidence supporting them. That same source ledger is linked in the description, so every testable point can be checked directly. The fault line is the most important part of the process. It's the point of dependency, the part of the argument that has to be true for everything else to follow. If you remove it, the argument can't stand. Most debates never really isolate this. They argue around it. They reinforce the conclusion, but they don't test the structure that produces it. That's why the same argument keeps repeating, because the core assumption is never examined directly. Take a simple claim. Adding more lanes to a highway will reduce traffic. At face value, that sounds reasonable. More space should mean less congestion. The strongest version of that claim would say, traffic is caused by limited space, so if you increase capacity, traffic should decrease. Now we isolate the fault line, the mechanism. Traffic congestion is primarily driven by insufficient road space. If that's true, then increasing road space should reduce congestion. From that, we get a prediction. If this expectation holds, then after expanding a highway, we should see sustained reductions in traffic congestion over time. Not temporary, sustained. Now we test that against reality. In many cases, what we actually observe is different. Traffic improves briefly and then returns to previous levels, sometimes worse. Why? Because increasing capacity changes behavior. More people choose to use the road. Travel patterns shift. Demand expands to fill the new space. Which means the original mechanism, that congestion is primarily caused by limited capacity, doesn't fully hold. And that leads to a structural verdict. The claim is incomplete. Not entirely wrong, but the mechanism it depends on isn't strong enough to produce the predicted outcome. So the conclusion doesn't hold as stated. That's the difference. The argument isn't accepted or rejected based on preference. It's tested based on whether its mechanism produces outcomes that match reality. And when it doesn't, a conclusion is still reached. The explanation is either incomplete, misspecified, or structurally incorrect, which means it doesn't hold in its current form. That's the standard. Every argument gets pushed to a point where it either survives or it doesn't. And if it doesn't, it resolves as failed or insufficient. No ambiguity, no indefinite debate. A structural conclusion is always reached. That's the standard here. That's how we test the structure. And this is the Section 451 brief.